When my mom sat me down and told me my dad had passed away, I thought it was the worst news I'd ever receive. But months later, I discovered the truth, a shocking secret that turned my world upside down and made me question everything I thought I knew about my family. It started with a conversation so unexpected, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I was home for the weekend, sitting at the kitchen table with my mom when she took a deep breath and said, "I need to tell you something." There was something in her tone, a mix of dread and resignation, that immediately set me on edge. "What's wrong?" I asked. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes, her hands trembling as she reached across the table. "It's your dad," she said softly. He passed away." The words hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible. I froze, the weight of her statement crashing over me. "What?" I managed to stammer. "How?" "A heart attack," she said, her voice breaking. It was sudden. There wasn't anything anyone could do. The rest of the day passed in a blur, a haze of disbelief and grief. My dad and I hadn't been particularly close in recent years. Our relationship had grown distant after my parents' divorce, but he was still my dad. The thought of him being gone forever left a gaping hole in my chest, one that no amount of rationalizing could fill. I spent hours on the phone, calling relatives to share the news, and trying to find some sense of closure. Each conversation felt surreal, as though I were reciting lines from someone else's tragedy. Mom, meanwhile, kept to herself, sitting quietly in the corner of the living room with a tissue clutched in her hand. Her grief seemed muted, restrained in a way that didn't match the situation. She offered little more than monosyllabic answers to my questions, her gaze fixed on the floor. Something about the whole situation felt incomplete. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind raced with questions I hadn't yet asked. Why hadn't there been a phone call from the hospital? Where was the obituary? What about a funeral? The next morning, I brought it up with Mom over breakfast. "When's the funeral?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the unease building inside me. She hesitated, her fork hovering over her plate. "Your dad didn't want a funeral," she said finally. "He wasn't one for ceremonies. He wanted things to be simple." It wasn't the answer I was expecting, but it was plausible. Dad had always been a private person, someone who preferred to keep his emotions close to the chest. Still, it didn't explain why none of my aunts, uncles, or cousins had reached out with condolences. "Did anyone else know?" I pressed. "I've told them," Mom said quickly, her tone sharp enough to shut down further questioning. "They'll reach out when they're ready." Her response didn't sit well with me, but I let it go. I wanted to believe her, to trust that she was just grieving in her own way. But as the days went on, the gaps in her story became harder to ignore. Something wasn't adding up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to my dad's death than she was letting on. And though I didn't know it at the time, I was right. In the days following my mom's revelation about my dad's death, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. The entire situation felt too quiet, too contained. There was no obituary in the paper, no memorial service being planned, and no outpouring of sympathy from family or friends. It was as if the world had simply moved on, oblivious to the fact that my dad was gone. When I brought this up with my mom, her responses only deepened my unease. "Your dad didn't want a big fuss," she said one morning over coffee, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her mug. "You know how private he was. This is what he would have wanted." It sounded plausible enough, but the explanation didn't sit right with me. My dad had always been reserved, sure, but he wasn't a ghost. He had family, friends, colleagues, people who would have cared, people who would have wanted to say goodbye. So why hadn't anyone reached out? Why was it just the two of us mourning in silence? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. When I asked my mom about the hospital where he had been treated, she deflected, saying, "It all happened so fast." By the time I got there, it was already too late. When I asked why none of his siblings or old friends had called, she grew irritated. "People grieve in their own ways," she snapped. "Not everyone wants to talk about it." Her defensiveness only added to my doubts. Mom wasn't the type to hide things, at least, not that I'd ever noticed, but now she seemed intent on keeping the details of my dad's death under wraps. The vague answers, the abrupt tone, the way she avoided eye contact whenever I brought him up, it all felt wrong. Finally, I decided I needed to get answers from someone else. I hadn't spoken to my dad's brother, Uncle Mike, in years, not since a falling out between him and my mom, but I knew he was the kind of person who wouldn't sugarcoat the truth. When I called Mike, I felt a knot of nerves in my stomach. I wasn't sure how he'd react to hearing from me after so long, but he picked up on the second ring, his voice gruff but familiar. "Hey, Mike," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "It's me." There was a pause, then a slight softening in his voice. "Hey, kiddo. Long time no hear. What's going on?" I hesitated for a moment before diving in. I just wanted to let you know about Dad," I said. "He passed away last week. A heart attack." The line went silent. For a moment, I thought the call had dropped, but then Mike's voice came back, quieter this time. "What are you talking about?" I frowned, confused. "Mom told me. She said he died suddenly." "Didn't she tell you?" Another pause, this one heavier. "Your dad's not dead," Mike said finally. "I saw him last month. He was fine." The words hit me like a brick. "What?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what your mom told you," Mike continued, his tone a mix of confusion and anger, "but your dad's alive. He's not in great shape, but he's alive." What the hell is going on over there? I didn't have an answer. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what Mike had just told me. If my dad wasn't dead, then what reason could my mom possibly have for lying? "I don't know," I said finally, my voice shaking. "But I'm going to find out." Mike's words echoed in my mind like a haunting refrain. "Your dad's not dead." I couldn't stop replaying the call, every sentence layering confusion on top of anger. Why would my mom lie about something so monumental? And if my dad was alive, where was he? By the time evening rolled around, I couldn't keep my questions bottled up any longer. My mom was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when I walked in, my heart pounding. "Why did you tell me Dad died?" I demanded, skipping any pretense of small talk. She froze, the knife she'd been holding hovering over a cutting board. Slowly, she set it down and turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "What are you talking about?" she asked, though her voice lacked conviction. "I talked to Uncle Mike," I said, my tone unwavering. "He says Dad's alive. So why did you lie to me?" For a moment, the tension in the room was suffocating. My mom's face crumpled, and I thought she might actually start crying. But instead, she let out a heavy sigh and leaned against the counter, avoiding my gaze. "Because you deserve better than the truth," she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. The cryptic answer only fueled my frustration. "What does that even mean?" I snapped. "How is lying to me about Dad better than the truth?" She shook her head, still refusing to look at me. "Some things are better left buried," she murmured. "No," I said, my voice rising. "You don't get to make that decision for me. I have a right to know the truth." Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment, I thought I'd broken through her defenses. But when she finally spoke, her tone was sharp. "You don't know what you're asking for," she said. "Sometimes the truth isn't what you want it to be." "Stop talking in riddles," I shouted, slamming my hand on the counter. "Is he alive or not?" "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely audible. The confirmation sent a jolt through me, but it wasn't enough. "Where is he?" I demanded. Her expression darkened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something like fear in her eyes. "I don't know," she said. "And even if I did, I wouldn't tell you." "Why not?" I asked, incredulous. "Because it's complicated," she said, her tone firm. "And because I'm trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" "From him," she said simply. Her words left me speechless. My dad had never been the warmest or most attentive parent, but he wasn't a monster. At least I didn't think he was. What could he have done to make her go to such lengths to hide the truth? "I don't need your protection," I said finally, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "I need the truth." But my mom just shook her head, her jaw set in a way that told me she wouldn't budge. "You've heard all you need to hear," she said, turning back to the cutting board. "Leave it alone." Her dismissal stung, but it also solidified my resolve. If she wouldn't give me answers, I'd have to find them on my own. Whatever secrets she was keeping, I was determined to uncover them, even if it meant uncovering things I wasn't ready to face. The tension with my mom lingered, her cryptic warnings ringing in my ears. But if she thought I would leave things alone, she didn't know me as well as she thought. Determined to uncover the truth about my dad, I started digging into every corner of the house, searching for anything that might fill in the gaps. It began with his old desk, a cluttered mess that hadn't been touched since my parents divorced. The drawers were filled with the mundane detritus of daily life, expired coupons, pens that no longer worked, and random papers that seemed meaningless. But tucked away in the back of the bottom drawer, I found an unassuming manila envelope. Inside were receipts, notes, and even a few photos. At first, they didn't seem particularly noteworthy, until I noticed the recurring name Karen scrawled in his handwriting. There were also mentions of the kids. At first, I thought it might be work-related. My dad had been a consultant, traveling frequently, and working with a variety of clients. Maybe Karen was a colleague, and the kids were shorthand for her family. But as I sifted through the documents, that explanation started to fall apart. The receipts were mostly for personal expenses, dinners at local restaurants, tickets to events, and even rent payments for a modest apartment in a town 2 hours away. The notes mentioned birthdays, school schedules, and holidays, all things that didn't align with my dad's professional life. One note in particular caught my attention. Written in his unmistakable handwriting, it read, "Pick up Karen's gift, jewelry store on Main. Don't forget to sign the card for me and the kids." A chill ran down my spine. These weren't coworkers or casual acquaintances. These were people he cared about deeply, enough to make regular trips, cover expenses, and remember the details of their lives. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. My dad hadn't just been distant or distracted. He had been living a second life. A life that, until now, had been completely hidden from me. I sat on the floor surrounded by evidence of a family I didn't know existed, my mind racing with questions. How long had this been going on? Did my mom know about Karen and the kids? And if so, was this the reason she had lied to me about my dad's death? The thought made me nauseous. My parents' divorce had been painful but relatively uneventful, or so I had thought. Was it possible that this secret family had been the cause? I decided to dig deeper, focusing on the town mentioned in the receipts. It wasn't far, just a couple of hours' drive. If my dad had truly been spending time there, someone would know him, or at least know Karen. As I gathered the papers and put them back in the envelope, one thing became painfully clear. I was about to uncover a truth that could change everything I thought I knew about my family. But I couldn't stop now. I had to know the full story, no matter where it led. The drive to the town felt surreal, a mix of determination and dread gnawing at me the entire way. The receipts and notes clutched in my bag were the only guide I had, leading me toward answers I wasn't sure I was ready for. When I finally reached the address listed on one of the receipts, I parked a few houses away and stared at the modest home in silence. A neatly trimmed lawn, a small garden, and a couple of bikes leaning against the garage. On the surface, it looked like any other house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. But parked in the driveway, unmistakably, was my dad's car. The sight of it sent a jolt through me. It was the same car I had seen countless times growing up, the one I had assumed was long gone. Now it sat here, out of place and painfully familiar. I sat in my car for what felt like an eternity, watching the house and trying to summon the courage to knock. What would I even say? What if I was wrong? But deep down, I knew I wasn't. Finally, I got out, my heart pounding as I walked up the driveway. I knocked on the door, my knuckles hesitant against the wood. Moments later, it opened, and a woman appeared. She looked to be in her 40s, with kind eyes and a cautious smile that faltered the moment she saw me. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but uncertain. "I'm looking for my dad," I said awkwardly, struggling to find the right words. "Is he here?" Her face fell instantly, and she glanced over her shoulder, as if weighing her next move. The silence stretched uncomfortably until she finally stepped aside. A moment later, my dad appeared in the hallway, his face pale as a ghost. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice shaking. For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. Seeing him standing there, alive and in the flesh, made my chest tighten with a mix of anger and relief. "What am I doing here?" I repeated, my voice rising. "I could ask you the same thing. Mom told me you were dead." His expression darkened, and he glanced at the woman, Karen, I assumed, before stepping closer to the door. "This isn't the time or place for this," he said quietly, his tone almost pleading. "No," I said firmly, my emotions bubbling to the surface. "You don't get to decide that. I deserve an explanation." The woman, clearly uncomfortable, put a hand on my dad's arm. "Should I go?" she asked softly. He shook his head, letting out a heavy sigh. "No," he said, turning back to me. "Come in. Let's talk." Reluctantly, I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the space for clues. The house was cozy and well lived in, with family photos on the walls and a stack of school books on the kitchen counter. But what caught my attention most was a framed picture on the mantel. My dad, the woman, and two kids who looked to be in their early teens. My heart sank as the realization hit me. This wasn't just a house. This was a home. And those weren't just kids. They were my half-siblings. "Is this your family's?" I asked, pointing to the photo. "Yes," my dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is Karen. And these are my kids." The room felt like it was spinning as I struggled to process his words. My dad hadn't just been hiding. He'd been living an entirely separate life, one that didn't include me or my mom. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. "How long?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How long have you been lying to us?" He looked away, shame written all over his face. "Years," he admitted. "Since before you were born." The weight of his confession left me speechless. I had come here searching for answers, but all I found were more questions, and a family I never knew existed. The tension in the room was suffocating as I sat across from my dad and the woman who, until moments ago, had been a complete stranger to me. Karen, his wife. The mother of my half-siblings. Every glance at the framed family photos on the walls or the shoes piled by the door only deepened my sense of betrayal. "I can explain," Dad began, his voice low and hesitant, but I wasn't in the mood for carefully constructed excuses. "How long?" I demanded, cutting him off. My voice was sharp, the anger I had been holding back now bubbling to the surface. "How long have you been living this lie?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Years," he said finally, barely audible. "Since before you were born." The weight of his confession hit me like a punch to the gut. "Before I was born?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "You've had this family the entire time? While Mom and I were what? Just your side project?" Karen looked heartbroken, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I didn't know," she said softly, her voice shaking. "Not at first. He told me he was divorced, that you and your mom were part of his past." Her words only added fuel to the fire. "Part of his past?" I snapped, glaring at my dad. "Is that how you justified it? By pretending we didn't exist?" "It wasn't like that," he said quickly, his tone pleading. "I didn't want things to turn out this way. I thought I could keep both lives separate, but you couldn't," I interrupted, my hands shaking. "Because lies like this don't stay hidden forever." For the first time, I noticed the kids standing in the doorway, their wide eyes darting between us. They looked confused and scared, as if their entire world was crumbling in front of them. It struck me then that they were as much victims of my dad's deception as I was. "Do they know?" I asked, gesturing toward the kids. Karen shook her head, her face pale. "No," she said. "Not until now." One of the kids, a boy who looked about 13, stepped forward hesitantly. "Mom? Who is this?" he asked, his voice small. Karen's eyes filled with tears, and she struggled to find the words. "This is your dad's daughter," she said finally. From his other family." The boy's face twisted in confusion, while his younger sister clung to Karen's arm, looking on the verge of tears. Seeing their reactions was like looking in a mirror. I could see my own hurt and confusion reflected back at me. I turned back to my dad, my anger giving way to exhaustion. "You didn't just lie to me," I said quietly. "You lied to them, too. You lied to everyone." He opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his guilt. For the first time, he looked truly broken, as though the enormity of what he had done was finally sinking in. "I didn't want this," he said again, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want anyone to get hurt." "Well, congratulations," I said bitterly. "Because that's all you've managed to do." Karen stood then, guiding the kids out of the room with a quiet, "Go upstairs, please. I need to talk to your father." They obeyed reluctantly, casting glances over their shoulders as they disappeared up the stairs. When the door to their room clicked shut, Karen turned back to my dad, her expression cold. "You told me this was over," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You promised me there were no more secrets." "I thought it was," he said, his voice hollow. "I didn't think she'd come looking for me." His words stung, a reminder that he had actively worked to keep me in the dark. "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked, my voice rising again. "You've been lying to everyone for decades, and now you're acting like this is my fault for finding out?" The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. For the first time, my dad had nothing to say. I stood, my legs shaky but determined. "I can't do this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to leave." Karen didn't try to stop me, her own pain etched across her face. My dad, however, reached for me as I passed, his hand falling short as I pulled away. "I'm sorry," he said weakly. "Not good enough," I replied, slamming the door behind me as I left. When I got back home, my emotions were a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and confusion. The confrontation with my dad had left me raw, but I wasn't done searching for answers. There was still one person I needed to confront: my mom. As I walked into the house, she was sitting in her usual spot in the living room, a book resting on her lap. She glanced up as I entered, her expression cautious. It was as if she already knew what was coming. "We need to talk," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She sighed, closing her book and setting it aside. "I take it you found him," she said, her tone weary. Her lack of surprise hit me like a slap. "You knew?" I asked, incredulous. "You knew he wasn't dead?" She nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I knew," she said quietly. "I figured you'd find out eventually." I stared at her, my mind racing. "How long have you known?" "For years," she admitted, her voice steady, but filled with a sadness I hadn't expected. "I found out not long after you were born. It was a shock, to say the least." "Then why didn't you tell me?" I demanded, my frustration boiling over. "Why let me believe he was dead?" She hesitated, clearly searching for the right words. "Because I didn't want you to deal with it," she said finally. "When he left, I thought it would be easier to just say he was gone. I wanted to protect you." Her explanation only deepened my sense of betrayal. "Protect me?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "By lying to me? By pretending he was dead instead of telling me the truth?" "It wasn't an easy decision," she said defensively. "I thought I was doing what was best for you. I didn't want you to grow up knowing what kind of man he really was." Her words stung, but they also left me with more questions. "So you just what? Let him walk away and start over with another family? You never thought I had a right to know?" "I thought about it," she said softly. "Every day I thought about it. But by the time I found out about them, he was already gone. What good would it have done to tell you? It wouldn't have changed anything." Her logic made sense in a twisted way, but it didn't make me feel any better. "You had years to tell me the truth," I said. "Years. Instead, you let me grieve someone who wasn't even dead. Do you have any idea how cruel that is?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said. "I thought I was sparing you. Maybe I was wrong, but I was trying to do what I thought was right." Her admission left me conflicted. On one hand, I could see that she had acted out of fear and a misguided sense of love. On the other, I couldn't ignore the fact that her decision had robbed me of the chance to understand my dad, or at least the man he truly was. For the first time, I realized that both of my parents had lied to me in their own ways. My dad had hidden an entire family, living a double life without a shred of remorse. And my mom had chosen to keep me in the dark, building a narrative that suited her idea of what I needed. It left me feeling adrift, unsure of who I could trust anymore. The foundation of my family, the people who were supposed to love and protect me, felt irreparably cracked. I stood there for a moment, staring at my mom as she wiped away tears. Finally, I shook my head and turned to leave the room. "I need time," I said, my voice hollow. "I can't deal with this right now." She didn't try to stop me, and for that, I was grateful. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking away from more than just a conversation. I was walking away from a version of my life that would never feel whole again. The fallout from the discovery of my dad's secret life was like a bomb detonating at the center of my family. The shockwaves rippled through every relationship, turning even the simplest interactions into minefields. My dad, now aware that the truth was out, tried repeatedly to reconnect. "I want to explain," he said during one of his many phone calls. "I know I've hurt you, but I never stopped caring about you." His words felt hollow. How could he claim to care when he had spent years building a life that didn't include me? Every time he called, I let it go to voicemail, the sound of his voice stirring too much anger and pain to handle. My mom, meanwhile, insisted she had done what was best for me. "You were just a kid," she argued during one of our increasingly tense conversations. "What good would it have done for you to know the truth back then?" "It's not about what was good for me," I snapped. "It's about what I deserve to know. You can't just rewrite my life because it's easier for you." Our arguments became a near-daily occurrence, with neither of us willing to back down. I could see the toll it was taking on her, her usually calm demeanor frayed at the edges, but I couldn't bring myself to let it go. The tension didn't stay contained within our immediate family. Word of my dad's double life and my mom's deception spread quickly to extended family members, and everyone seemed to have an opinion. Some relatives sided with my mom, saying she had done what any mother would to protect her child. Others couldn't believe she had kept the secret for so long, accusing her of enabling my dad's betrayal. "He's the one who lied first," my Aunt Brenda said during a particularly heated family gathering. "Why is everyone blaming her for trying to shield her child from the truth?" "Because she lied too," my cousin Eric shot back. "She didn't shield anyone. She just added another layer of deceit. They're both guilty." Every conversation turned into a shouting match, with grievances that had nothing to do with my dad's secret life suddenly being dragged into the open. Old resentments bubbled to the surface, turning family gatherings into battlegrounds. The weight of it all was unbearable. The stability I had always taken for granted, the idea that family would always be a safe haven, crumbled before my eyes. Caught in the middle, I felt like I was losing everything. My dad's attempts to reach out felt disingenuous, my mom's insistence that she had acted out of love rang hollow, and my extended family's infighting only made things worse. There were moments when I considered walking away from all of it, cutting ties with everyone and starting fresh. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the solution. As angry and hurt as I was, I still wanted answers. I still wanted closure. But as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that reconciliation wouldn't come easily. The scars from my dad's betrayal and my mom's lies ran deep, and healing felt like an impossible task. For the first time in my life, I felt truly untethered, unsure of where I belonged or who I could trust. All I knew was that the family I thought I had was gone, replaced by something fractured and unfamiliar. And I wasn't sure it could ever be put back together. In the weeks following the explosive fallout, I realized I couldn't keep living in anger. The constant churn of resentment was wearing me down, leaving me exhausted and stuck in a loop of questions that had no satisfying answers. I decided to seek help and started therapy, a choice that felt overdue but necessary. At first, the sessions were uncomfortable. Talking about my family's betrayal dredged up emotions I hadn't fully processed, and admitting that I felt lost and hurt wasn't easy. But as time went on, therapy became a refuge, a space where I could start untangling the knots that had formed in my mind. One of the first things my therapist helped me understand was that my parents' actions, while deeply hurtful, were rooted in their own fears and flaws. My dad's decision to live a double life wasn't just about selfishness, it was also about his inability to confront the consequences of his choices. My mom's lie wasn't just about deception, it was her way of protecting me, however misguided. Armed with this perspective, I decided it was time to face my dad again. This time, I wasn't looking for apologies or justifications. I wanted clarity. I needed to understand why he had made the choices he did, and more importantly, I needed to figure out if there was any path forward for us. I reached out to him, and to my surprise, he agreed to meet without hesitation. We chose a neutral spot, a quiet cafe halfway between his town and mine. When he walked in, I was struck by how tired he looked. The confident, composed man I remembered was gone, replaced by someone who seemed weighed down by guilt and regret. "Thanks for meeting me," he said as he sat down. "I need answers," I replied, skipping the pleasantries. "If you're ready to be honest, I'm ready to listen." He nodded, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his coffee cup. "I've made a mess of things," he began, his voice heavy. "I thought I could keep everything separate, compartmentalized. I told myself it was better this way, that I was giving both families what they needed. But in the end, I was just running from the consequences." Hearing him admit his failings was both painful and strangely relieving. For the first time, he wasn't trying to excuse or justify his actions. He was taking responsibility. As the conversation unfolded, I began to see my dad not as the larger-than-life figure I'd grown up with, but as a flawed human being. He talked about how his fear of losing everything had driven him to make choices he now deeply regretted. He admitted that he had been a coward, too scared to face the fallout of his double life until it was too late. "Do you even realize what you've done to me? To Mom? To them?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of my emotions. He looked me in the eye, his expression raw. "I do," he said, "and I'll never forgive myself for it." It wasn't a perfect answer. It didn't erase the years of pain or undo the damage. But it was honest, and in that moment it was enough. My relationship with my mom, however, remained strained. While I had started to understand her perspective, the hurt from her lies still lingered. She had taken away my choice to face the truth, deciding for me what I could handle. But as I reflected on her intentions, I began to see that her actions, like my dad's, were born out of fear. She had been trying to protect me, even if she had gone about it in the worst possible way. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward empathy. And in the chaos of everything that had happened, that felt like progress. Looking back on everything that unfolded, it's hard to believe how much my life has changed. What began with a lie about my dad's death unraveled into a tangled web of deception, betrayal, and hidden truths. But amid the chaos, I've found clarity in ways I never expected. The experience taught me lessons about family I couldn't have learned any other way. I've come to understand that family isn't always the perfect, supportive unit we idealize. It's messy, complicated, and deeply human. People make mistakes, sometimes devastating ones, and those mistakes ripple outward, affecting everyone they touch. The hardest lesson was learning the importance of forgiveness, not for their sake, but for mine. Carrying anger and resentment only weighed me down, keeping me trapped in the pain of what had happened. Forgiveness didn't mean excusing their actions or forgetting the hurt. It meant letting go of the burden and choosing to move forward. My relationship with my parents remains complicated, but it's no longer defined by the lies that came between us. With my dad, I've established boundaries that allow us to rebuild slowly. He's made genuine efforts to be part of my life, though I've made it clear that trust is something he'll have to earn over time. Surprisingly, I've found a sense of connection with my half-siblings. Meeting them was one of the more surreal parts of this journey, but as we spent time together, I realized they were just as blindsided as I was. They didn't ask to be part of my dad's double life, and they've had their own struggles coming to terms with the truth. Over the months, we've grown closer, finding solace in our shared experiences. It's a strange bond, born out of something so painful, but it's become a source of comfort and healing. In some ways, they've helped fill the void left by the fractured relationships with my parents. With my mom, the road to reconciliation has been slower. Her lie, though rooted in a desire to protect me, created a distance between us that's been difficult to bridge. But through therapy and countless conversations, I've begun to see her not just as my mom, but as a person, someone who made a flawed, human decision in an impossible situation. We're still working on rebuilding our relationship, but there's progress. I've learned to set boundaries here, too, ensuring that our interactions are based on honesty moving forward. It's not perfect, but it's a start. In the end, my dad's secret didn't destroy me. It broke parts of me, yes, but it also forced me to grow in ways I never thought possible. I've become stronger, more self-aware, and more determined to build a life rooted in truth and integrity. The road to healing is long, and I know there will be setbacks. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm moving forward, one step at a time, leaving the weight of the past behind me. And that, more than anything, feels like freedom.